The screen of Evan Mitchell's laptop glowed in the darkness of his Brooklyn bedroom, casting uneven shadows across walls covered in sticky notes filled with URLs, screenshots, and diagrams mapping connections between anonymous 4chan users he had been tracking for the past 3 weeks. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in March 2025, and Evan had been navigating the darkest boards of the forum for 6 straight hours, reading accounts that shifted between disturbing and outright terrifying. Stories about inexplicable disappearances, digital invasions that turned into real-world nightmares, and people claiming to have been contacted by entities that knew intimate details about their lives with no logical explanation for how such information could have been obtained. As a 24-year-old journalism student at Columbia University, Evan had developed a particular obsession with internet culture, especially phenomena emerging from places where anonymity allowed individuals to reveal their darkest thoughts without immediate consequences. And 4chan was perhaps the purest example of a space where the boundary between reality and fiction blurred until it became almost impossible to distinguish one from the other. His apartment, which he shared with 2 university roommates, was located in a typical red-brick Brooklyn building from the 1970s, with uneven heating that made the rooms too hot in the winter and suffocating in the summer, and windows overlooking a relatively quiet street where the constant hum of city traffic never fully disappeared, even during the deepest hours of the night. New York in 2025 was a city that had never stopped evolving technologically. Facial recognition systems on every corner, drones buzzing overhead delivering packages, and a population practically fused to their devices to the point where urban life was no longer purely physical, but a constant hybrid of real and digital worlds intertwining in ways previous generations could never have imagined. Evan had grown up in the suburbs of New Jersey in a middle-class family where both parents worked in tech, his mother a software engineer and his father a product manager at an AI startup. So he had been exposed to digital culture from a young age. He developed both fascination and a healthy skepticism about the promises and dangers of emerging technologies that continually transformed how people communicated, worked, and built their identities in increasingly virtual spaces. The particular 4chan thread Evan was reading that night had been started by an anonymous user, claiming to have evidence that several people who had disappeared across the United States over the past 2 years had been active on the forum shortly before vanishing, and that their final posts contained strange linguistic patterns and cryptic references, suggesting they had been contacted or manipulated by someone or something operating within the platform. Initial interactions looked harmless, but gradually became increasingly invasive and psychologically destabilizing. The claims were extraordinary, the kind Evan would normally dismiss as typical conspiracy fodder that thrived in spaces where paranoia was the norm and where users often fabricated elaborate stories to gain attention or simply to troll gullible readers. But what made him hesitate was that the user had provided links to verifiable news articles about real missing person cases and pointed to specific timestamps of archived posts that did in fact match the dates and details being discussed. These correlations could have been coincidences, but they also could have signaled a real pattern unnoticed by others simply because it required the obsessive, hour-countless labor of someone willing to track scattered threads and piece them together. Evan copied all the information into a separate document he had been building, with every case he considered potentially worth deeper investigation, adding notes about which elements needed verification and which sources he could contact to determine whether there was genuine substance behind these claims or whether it was just another rabbit hole leading nowhere but misinformation and baseless speculation. His phone vibrated with a message from Maya Torres, his friend and occasional collaborator who worked as a cybersecurity analyst at a consulting firm in Manhattan and often helped him with the technical aspects of his research whenever he needed to track IP addresses or understand the anonymization tools used by 4chan users. The message read, "Evan, it's 2 a.m. and you're researching again, aren't you? We talked about this. You need sleep and you need healthier boundaries with this investigation. It's consuming you, and it isn't sustainable mentally or physically. Let's talk tomorrow. I have information you'll want to hear about that disappearance pattern you mentioned last week." Maya, 30 years old and nearly a decade into her cybersecurity career after graduating from MIT, had been part of teams investigating serious cybercrimes, from financial fraud to child exploitation. Her experience had given her a realistic and often grim understanding of the dangers lurking in digital spaces that most people assumed were relatively contained or harmless. Evan knew Maya was right about needing better boundaries, but he also knew that when he was in the middle of an especially promising lead, it was nearly impossible for him to disconnect or sleep. His mind would keep processing information, asking new questions, forming new connections that pushed him to continue digging, even when his body begged for rest. Evan finally closed his laptop around 3 in the morning and collapsed into bed, brain exhausted in a way that had become familiar during the past few weeks. He slept barely 4 hours before waking at 7 for his investigative journalism seminar, where he was scheduled to present an update on his thesis project. During his presentation, he tried to explain the patterns he had found in terrifying 4chan narratives without sounding paranoid, or as if he had lost the ability to distinguish correlation from causation. He emphasized that what fascinated him wasn't whether these stories were literally true, but how they functioned as contemporary mythology, revealing collective anxieties about technology, privacy, identity, and the increasingly porous boundaries between online and offline life in a hyper-connected society where nearly everything people did left a digital trace that could be tracked, analyzed, or exploited by malicious actors. His professor, a veteran journalist in his late 50s who had spent 20 years at the New York Times before moving into academia, listened with growing concern. After Evan finished speaking, the professor asked a question that would echo in the young man's mind for days. "Evan, your project is fascinating, but I have to ask honestly, are you taking the necessary steps to protect your psychological and digital safety while conducting this research? Prolonged exposure to disturbing content has documented effects on mental health. And navigating spaces like 4chan, where genuinely dangerous actors operate, can expose you to real risks beyond just reading unpleasant stories." The question was valid, and it was one Evan had been avoiding. Admitting the research affected him negatively would mean considering altering his approach, or even abandoning the project entirely. Options he wasn't ready to accept, especially now that he felt on the verge of discovering something meaningful about dark digital culture and what it revealed about modern society. After class, he met Maya at a cafe near the Columbia campus, a quiet, cozy place known for specialty coffee, popular among students and professors seeking refuge from the constant noise of the university library. Maya arrived with her laptop tucked under her arm, wearing the serious expression Evan recognized as a sign she had found something significant. After ordering their drinks, they sat at a corner table where they could speak privately. "Evan, I looked into those disappearance cases you mentioned, and I found something I think you need to see," Maya said, as she opened her laptop and turned it toward him. On the screen was a compiled document with information about 5 individuals who had gone missing in different states over the past 2 years. Every one of these people had an active presence on 4chan, specifically on HX and BR, where most of the disturbing content concentrates. All of them made posts in the days leading up to their disappearance using language that didn't match their usual writing style. I compared linguistic patterns using archived posts. Evan's pulse quickened as he studied the document. This was exactly the kind of correlation he had been looking for, but lacked the tools to identify on his own. The 5 cases included a 22-year-old university student in Oregon who vanished after posting messages describing being contacted by someone who knew personal details he had never shared publicly. A 28-year-old programmer in Texas who wrote about feeling digitally surveilled in ways she couldn't explain, and 3 others with similar stories of escalating paranoia tied to online interactions that seemed impossibly invasive. "What do you think it means?" Evan asked, though part of him already knew what Maya would say. "It means someone, or a group, is using 4chan as a hunting ground. They identify vulnerable individuals and initiate contact in ways that seem harmless at first, but gradually destabilize them psychologically until they're scared or confused enough to take irrational risks. And it means that if you keep digging so openly, there's a real chance you'll become a target. These actors monitor who's paying attention. They've harassed, and worse, people who tried to expose them." The warning was terrifying precisely because it came from Maya, someone whose judgment Evan trusted, someone who had real experience investigating dangerous digital environments. But Evan also felt that backing away now, when the evidence was finally aligning, would betray the responsibility he believed he had as a journalist to uncover uncomfortable truths. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. Maya considered his question before answering. "First, you need proper anonymization tools. No more browsing from your home IP. Second, stop posting updates about your research on social media. Third, and maybe most important, you need someone keeping you grounded. When you spend this much time immersed in disturbing content, your perception of what's real and what's psychological manipulation becomes compromised in ways you don't notice until it's too late." Over the next few days, Evan implemented all of Maya's recommendations, using a VPN and Tor each time he accessed 4chan and deliberately limiting how much he shared publicly. But he also continued digging deeper into the disappearance cases Maya had uncovered. He contacted the families of the victims whenever possible and reviewed public police reports for additional clues. What he found was both revealing and deeply unsettling. In at least 3 of the cases, relatives reported that their loved ones had been acting increasingly paranoid in the weeks before vanishing, speaking about being followed or digitally watched, changing their routines, and expressing fear about content they had seen online or interactions they couldn't fully explain. These patterns aligned with a form of systematic digital harassment known in cybersecurity literature as digital gaslighting, where perpetrators use stolen or scraped personal information to create the illusion of omnipresence, causing victims to question their sanity and isolate themselves from supportive networks. One night, as Evan used text analysis software Maya had given him to sift through old, archived 4chan threads, his laptop began to behave strangely, windows opening and closing on their own, the cursor moving without his touch. At first, he chalked it up to malware, but the activity continued even after multiple security scans found nothing. He snapped a photo of the screen and sent it to Maya. She called him within 5 minutes. "Evan, disconnect your laptop from the internet. Now. Don't use it again until I can examine it." Her voice was sharper and more urgent than he had ever heard. "This sounds like unauthorized remote access. Someone has control of your machine, your files, your communications. They can see everything you're doing. This isn't random malware. This is exactly what I warned you about." The fear Evan felt then was unlike the abstract dread he'd experienced reading horror stories on 4chan. It was visceral. Someone had breached his personal space, watched him without his knowledge, penetrated the privacy he had taken for granted. He unplugged the laptop and waited in the dark, suddenly unsure of every device around him. His phone, the apartment lights, anything that could house a camera or microphone, the paranoia he had studied in others, now curled tightly around his own mind. The next day, Maya arrived with a digital forensics kit and spent 3 hours examining the machine. She eventually confirmed that Evan's laptop had been infiltrated with sophisticated malware that gave the attacker full access, including the ability to activate the camera and microphone remotely. "This is professional work, Evan," she said. "Not a hobbyist. Someone with real resources and intent decided you were worth targeting." The revelation forced Evan to confront the question he had avoided for weeks. Should he continue his investigation, knowing he had become a target? From a safety standpoint, the answer was obvious. Stop immediately. But from a journalistic standpoint, the answer was the opposite. If someone was willing to go this far to stop him, then what he had found was important. Maya saw the conflict on his face and didn't soften her warning. "Evan, the people behind this have made others disappear. If you continue, you need far stronger precautions, and a plan if things escalate beyond digital threats." The decision was agonizing, but after several days of reflection, Evan chose to continue, following every security protocol Maya set up. A separate offline laptop, encrypted communications, a daily check-in schedule, and absolute caution in everything he did. Weeks passed. Evan eventually identified a specific username that appeared repeatedly in threads tied to disappearance cases. A user who seemed to know intimate details about multiple victims and used that information to instill fear with psychological precision. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of the missing individuals had posted a photo on 4chan shortly before disappearing, an image taken from their apartment window. After running a reverse image search and geolocation tools Maya had taught him to use, Evan realized the photo had been taken just 3 blocks from his own apartment. The odds of that being a coincidence were nearly zero. He reviewed every post from that victim again and found an even more disturbing detail. In one of their final messages, the victim had mentioned working on a research project about 4chan culture and horror narratives. Exactly what Evan himself was doing. The similarity was too precise to ignore. It suggested a horrifying possibility. The pattern wasn't random. The targets were not arbitrary. They were researchers, investigators, people like him. He showed Maya the evidence. She went silent for a long moment before whispering, "Evan, we need to go to the FBI." But when they tried compiling the evidence, they discovered that key threads had been scrubbed, deleted so thoroughly that not even internet archival services had cached them. As if someone knew exactly which pieces they needed. The night before their scheduled meeting with the FBI, Evan received a direct message on a Twitter account he used only for research. "We know who you are, Evan Mitchell. We know where you live. We know you're meeting the feds tomorrow. But what you don't know is that one of the cases you were studying was you from the beginning. Welcome to the experiment." Attached was a photo taken outside Evan's apartment that very night. Proof that the threat had become physical. He immediately sent screenshots to Maya and told her he would stay in a hotel. She agreed, insisting she would do the same. The next day, the FBI took his situation seriously but offered limited short-term protection. One agent made a comment that haunted Evan long after the meeting. "Not everything on 4chan is a real threat. Part of the terror comes from never being able to confirm what's real. Sometimes the scariest story isn't the true one. It's the one you can't prove isn't true." Those words echoed in the days that followed as Evan tried to decide how to conclude his research without feeding into terror narratives designed to destabilize people like him. In the end, he realized the real story wasn't about whether the disappearances were literally true. It was about how spaces like 4chan had created an ecosystem where truth and fiction collapsed into one another so completely that terror no longer needed to be real to cause real psychological damage. A lesson he had learned more personally and more painfully than he ever imagined when he began, naively believing he could observe the darkness of the internet without being changed by it.